Hello YouTube, this is umils03. So in the previous video we talked about numeric functions, and we basically figured out some other ways to work with lists or sets of numbers, right? Numerical values. So we basically found out that we could have maximum of a list, okay? Or we could have minimum of a list. We could have absolute value of a number. We could also have maximum of just a comma separated collection of values. So let me tell you what I mean by that. But the first thing I want to do is I want to go over data type conversions again, because we've been saying a few more things about basically what we introduced later on in the curriculum is that bool of anything is 1 as long as the input is not 0 or false. And that's actually not true. There's one more input to bool of x that would return false, and that's the empty string. But let's go ahead and think about how we would take an int, float, string, or boolean into an int, float, string, or boolean. So for an int of a equals a. Float of a equals a, 0.0. So float of 8 is 8.0, okay? String of a is the string representation of a. That makes it easier to concatenate with a string, but it makes it impossible to use numerically. Bool of a is false if a equals 0. Bool of a is true for any other integer. For a float b, int of b, it would be the integer form of b. Float of b is just b. String of b is b, so that would be the string representation of b, which allows you to concatenate it with a string but not use it numerically. Bool of b is false if b is 0.0. Remember, we're talking about a floating point number now. Bool of b is true otherwise. For a string c, we know that int of c is the numerical form of c if c is in like integer-based string. So int of 444 is the number 444. Float of c, kind of the same thing, but if you basically had a floating point representation of a string, you could get the floating point numerical value out of that. String of c is just string. A string of a string is a string. And bool of c is false if c is an empty string, but bool of c is true if the length of c is greater than 0. So hopefully that makes sense to you. And then for a boolean d, int of d is 1 if d is true. So if you say int of something that's true, you would get 1. But int of d is 0. Okay, so if you pass in a false boolean, then int of that boolean is 0. Float of d is 1.0 for a true boolean. Float of d is 0.0 for a false boolean. String of d is the word true for a true boolean. String of d is the word false for a false boolean. And then bool of d is just d. So hopefully that makes sense. We talked about the split and the join functions in 2 lessons ago, not the previous one, but the one that's previous to the previous. But we did it pretty quickly at the end. So let's review this one more time real quick. So if we say my word, right, and then we could basically have a list of characters, right, a string, and you can see a separation. You can see that there's a lot of dots in here. So what we could do is we could declare that we're going to basically want to form a list that is based on this string. But the way that we're going to add elements to the list, the way that we're going to know where to splice this string to get elements into the list is with this separator. So now if you say myList equals myWord.split of my separator. So you need to say list equals string dot split of separator, and it would return that list. And you would see the a star 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 because the separator that we're looking for is not the stars. It's not any other grammar other than the star here. And then you could go back the other way. So you could say revert word equals my separator dot join of my list. Okay, so that would take all of these elements and it would just go ahead and stick my separator in between them and just make a string out of it. Okay, so we would expect my word and revert word to be the same. So basically that means that a string could be returned, right, by basically calling the s.split of separator on that string to get a list, and then you would join the elements of the list back together and you get the same string. Same thing for a list. What you would do is you would start with a list and then you would say separator.join of list. That would form a string, and then you could go ahead and separate the string again using the split function. So hopefully that makes sense to you. And then we'd have max and min of a list, a tuple, or a comma separated collection of values. You can do c equals round of a, b. That would give you the floating point number a, but with only b points of precision after the radix, okay? Sum of list, sum of array, those are both defined as well. And we saw examples of that in the previous video. Remember, if we say print of any of boolean for value in list, okay, so you could say basically like b, greater than 2 equals 0. So it's a boolean that applies to a particular variable, a value, and that variable or value shows up in the list. And we said that print of any of, anything at all, x equals 0 for x in list. Well, then if at least one of the elements is 0, then this any command returns true. But if any of the elements were not 0, then the all command would return false. So hopefully that makes sense to you. It's kind of like the difference between an or and an and, right? Or the difference between a union and an intersection, like we were talking about briefly with sets. Okay, so like range of 4 or dictionary.keys or enumerative v, remember we saw this in the previous lesson, it accepts a list v, but it doesn't return an iterable. You can iterate through iterative v, right? Like remember when we said for x in range of 4, you can say for t in enumerate of v, where v is some list. But to get an actual list or tuple out of it, you need to write list of enumerative v or tuple of enumerative v. Okay, and so we can go ahead and see that. So we can go ahead and say, we can go ahead and say eggs equals not 8, 88, 18, and 2, right? And then so what we could do is we could say basically print of tuple of enumerate of eggs. So that would basically go ahead and let's see what that returns. So then that would give you a tuple of tuples, right? Because we said that enumerate gives you tuples between each index position and the value at the corresponding index position. Obviously, if you wanted a list instead, you could go ahead and do that. You could set it equal to a value. You could say s equals list of enumerate of eggs, and then you could modify s however you see fit. So hopefully that's clear. And then so you could say something like for w in enumerative v, then you could just say print of w, okay? Or you could say, if you want to be more formal, if you actually want to make a list out of it and go through the elements in the list, it doesn't hurt. It's no problem to say, if you want to be more comfortable, a little bit safer, just say list of enumerative v or tuple of enumerative v. Same thing with these ones, right? List of range of 4, tuple of dictionary.keys, okay? That's all totally fine. So print of w, okay? We also said that functions can be inputs to other functions. So look at these two. So we have main function, it accepts a function and 3 inputs, and then basically it returns the result of that function that it accepted with the 3 other inputs, right? And so basically if you called main func with sumnum and 4 and 8 and 3, we would get 15, right? And you don't see any other parentheses here. So it's not sumnum of input 1, input 2, input 3, right? There's this, you just literally write the name of the function, and then it's going to go ahead and operate or apply that function with these particular inputs according to the way main func is defined. Let's talk about lambda functions. So basically we can come up with a very concise way of producing a function. Okay, so we already know how to produce a function. We could basically say give negative of x, right? And then we could return 0 minus x, right? And then so basically we could say something like give negative of 2, right? So it would just be the negative of that number. So negative 2 is negative 2, but negative 2 is positive 2. So hopefully that makes sense to you. But it turns out that we can actually come up with a way to write a function like this that is a little bit more compact, okay? It's a little bit more compact. So basically, if you had something that said, define y of variable name, so like y of x or f of x or anything you want, you can say return and then a function of that variable. So it could return x plus 2 or return x mod 4, or if x is a boolean, return x equals true, something like that. So then you can go ahead and think about that. But what I'm saying is that you can formulate these 2 lines of code into just 1 line of code by using a lambda function. So what you're going to do, you actually need parentheses. So what you're going to do is you're going to say y equals, and then look at this. So it's pretty simple. You're going to have a starting parentheses and then the word lambda, and then a name for a variable, and then a colon, and then what that function does. And then so these basically 2 segments of code would have the exact same effect. So now let's go ahead and turn this traditional function into a lambda function, okay? And so basically what we're going to do is we're going to say y equals, remember you have to basically, you would come up with, you could come up with basically a reference name. You can say reference name or something, okay? And that's your function name. So then you could go ahead and say, I guess this would be y, right? And so then if we want to go ahead, we could say give negative 2 equals, and then we need to write lambda. And then you can come up with any input that you want. Since I called it x in the original function, let's call it here, x here. So then you could say lambda x 0 minus x. Okay, so now if you say print give negative 2, right, of 5, then let's see what would happen. So it would return the negative of that number. So it would return negative 5. Okay, so this is a more compact way to define a function. Okay, so this was equivalent to above. So hopefully that makes sense to you, right? Give negative, now that's give negative here. Equals, and then you're going to say lambda and then x. What's the input? And then this would be talking about a function that returns something. Okay, so for Lambda functions, we're talking about functions that return something. So Lambda functions create a very compact way for us to return, for us to express a function that returns a value. So hopefully that makes sense to you. And then if you pass in a different value, what if you said give -2 of 18 plus 4, right? It evaluates 18 plus 4, and then it sticks that result into the function. So that's why you get -2. So hopefully that makes sense to you. So that's kind of basically Lambda functions, okay? What we're going to talk about now is we're going to talk about map of function iterable, okay? And basically it's going to be kind of like a numerative v and range of 4 and these other basically things that we've been looking at, right? Where we said enumerative v, this doesn't return a list, but it can be made into a list if you say list of enumerative v. Okay, and so this is another example of a command where it doesn't return a list, but it can be iterated through. So it can be iterated through using a for loop. You could say for w in map of function iterable, or if you want to be safe, list of map of function iterable. Okay, so what it does is it iterates through the elements of iterating through the elements of map would print the value of the function applied to each element in the iterable. So it accepts a function and like a list or a tuple or a set. And so basically if you say for y in map of function iterable and you say print y, it's going to print the result of the function when the inputs are basically in this iterable. So let me tell you what I'm talking about. We're going to go down to the bottom here, and then we're going to say basically I'm running out of variable names, so I'm just going to come up with some funny ones. So cookies, okay, and you could say 5, 12, 13, 6, and 100, okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say multiply by 100 of t. So I'm just going to create basically an ordinary function, and I'm going to say return t times 100, okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say for a, and then what you're going to do is you're going to say map of cookies, and then or map of multiply by 100. So you're going to specify the function first, and then you're going to go ahead and specify the list, right? So then this is go ahead multiply by 100. Okay, so this is the format. This is the format of the way that you would use map of function iterable. Okay, so this will basically iterate through the result of the function for each input in cookies. Okay, so that basically makes sense. So then if you say print of a, it's going to return, it's going to basically, what would be the first value? So it'd be 5 times 100 to print 500. Okay, and then 12 times 100 to print 1,200. So now if we go ahead and run it, you get 500, 1,200, 1,300, 600, and 10,000. So hopefully that makes sense to you. And we can also pass a lambda function into it. So let's go ahead and pass a lambda function into it. So what we're going to do is we're going to say lambda multiply, or I'm just going to say multiply by, I'm just going to say multiply by 200, okay, or we'll say multiply by 10, okay, so multiply by 10 equals, remember, lambda r, you can call it whatever you want, r times 10, right? So lambda and then some variable and then some function of that variable, right? It's pretty straightforward. And you could actually have 2 inputs, okay? So this is something that we'll bring up in a second, but let's finish this example first. So you could say return, or then you would just say r times 10, right? So that's the definition of your function. And then you could say for b in map of multiply by 10, that you can put a lambda function into it, okay? And then you would say cookies, we could use the same iterable on that. And then we could say print of b, okay? And then you can go ahead and run it. And you would just get the times 10s, right? So 50, 120, 130, 60, and 100. If you wanted to be safe, you could have said tuple of map of multiply by 100 in cookies, and that would have the exact same effect. So hopefully that makes sense to you, and hopefully you understand what's going on there. We can also have a lambda function that accepts 2 inputs. Lambda functions can accept more than 1 input, okay? So what if we want to say sum the 3, okay, equals lambda a, b, and q. You can call them whatever you want. And then you would just say a plus b plus q, right? How do you sum 3 numbers? Well, you basically add them together, okay? And so basically what you're going to have going on here, I just have to try to remind myself for what the syntax is if you want to go ahead and pass more than 1 input into a lambda function. So this should be it, okay? And I guess maybe we already used a and b. So let's call them v1, v2, and v3, but you just would separate them by commas. So separate the inputs by commas after you write lambda, but before the colon, Okay, and so then this would be, you know, you would define it by v1 plus v2 plus v3. Okay, and then you could go ahead and see something else with this, right? So then if you wanted to look at the result, let's take a look at what we could do here. So you could go ahead and print other values of that. So what if you said print sum to 3 of 8, 9, and 12? Okay, and so then that would have the effect of being able to add up those three numbers, and you would get that 29 that you're looking for. But basically what I'm trying to say is that Lambda functions can accept more than one input, and hopefully you understand how map of function iterable works. So map of function iterable will basically, if it will iterate through the result of the function called on the elements in the iterable. So hopefully that makes sense to you. Okay, and so that we see another example here. So add 5 equals lambda c plus 5, and then u equals 3, 23, 43. So if you say for a and map of add 5 and u, print of a, and then you could go ahead and then that would just print 8, 28, 48 on different lines. And then if you say print of tuple of map of add 5 and u, then it would print a tuple with those three results. So 8 because 3 plus 5 is 8, 28 because 23 plus 5 is 28, and 48 plus 4 because 48 because 43 plus 5 is 48. Okay, you can also have filter of predicate and iterable. So this is the last one we're going to talk about. I think we'll actually make it to the end today. So again, this is another example like range of 4 or enumerate of v or dictionary.keys or dictionary.items or map of function iterable. Again, we can iterate through it, but in and of itself, it's not a list or a tuple until we convert it into one. What this would do if we go ahead and call this, so if we try to iterate, we use a for loop or something, and we say for a in filter of, and then we're going to pass in a predicate and an iterable. Well, we know what an iterable is, okay? An iterable is basically just a list or a tuple, right? It's going to basically look at a collection of elements, so don't overthink that. The question is, what is a predicate? So a predicate is basically a boolean in Lambda syntax. Okay, so basically a predicate would basically be like lambda w, and then you would basically have f of w, where f of w is some boolean regarding w, where w is an element in the list. That's kind of basically what's going on here. So hopefully you understand that, but this is the syntax for it. This is literally what you pass in here. You say for a in filter, for anything in filter of, and then you're going to write lambda and then just have a variable name, just something that you're arbitrarily going to refer to each element in the list as. So I just said s. So I said for a in filter of lambda s, and then you're going to have a boolean after the colon, okay? And it's going to be a boolean expression that applies to, that particular element, that arbitrary element. What do you want to be true or false about that element? So what I'm doing in my predicate is I'm saying not s mod 2 equals 0. Okay, so basically we know that this command would basically return true if s is odd and false if s is even. Okay, and I'm going to be looking at these elements in the group list. So what this does is if I say for a in filter of lambda s, not s mod 2 equals 0 group, right? It's just two arguments, right? It's a predicate and an iterable, okay? And you're going to say print of a. So that would return all values of a in the group such that a is odd. So it returns all values where the predicate, all values in the iterable group where the predicate was satisfied. So it's basically chopping out values, and it's saying that we want to iterate through the values in the list where a particular boolean is satisfied. Okay, and so we can go ahead and see another example of that. So group of nums, right? And then you could say 3, -2, -1, 9, -0.5, and then we can say 2, -10. Okay, and then what we could say is we could say for t in tuple of, I'm going to go ahead and convert it to a tuple because we said that that's a harmless operation. And if you don't like this idea that things like enumerate of v and map of function iterable and filter of predicate iterable don't return tuples or lists, go ahead and do that right off the bat. So now you would say filter of, and then you would say lambda t, t less than 0. Okay, and then you would basically go ahead and say, and then you would basically go ahead and pass in the iterable. So you would pass in group of nums, and hopefully that makes sense to you. For t in tuple of filter of lambda t, t less than 0, right? And then I guess we shouldn't say t here because it's already going to call t the element, right? So you'd have to call it something else. You'd call it zebra, right? Zebra, but we said that that's arbitrary. And then we're going to go ahead and say this, right? And then we could say print of zebra. And so then this is going to only print the values. It's only going to print the values. We'd say print of t, right? Because we're referencing elements that satisfy this filter. So now it'll only print values that are less than 0. inside of group of nums. And so then you get those 4 values in the order they appeared in the list. So hopefully that was interesting for you. I know we covered a lot of content, but go ahead and practice it on your own. From me, Mozo3, thanks for watching, and please subscribe.